Hey guys, so the last couple days we've kind of been working towards talking about the digestive system. We've talked about nutrients, we've talked about enzymes. Today we're actually going to go through all of the different organs and structures of the digestive system. So in this lesson on the digestive system, we're going to be going over the pathway that food goes through the digestive system. We're also going to talk about each of the different structures and organs of the digestive system, including the accessory organs, which are organs that help with digestion, but that food doesn't actually pass through. And then we're going to talk about some of the different enzymes and hormones related to digestion. So there are 4 stages of the digestive process. There is ingestion, which is essentially eating, taking in food. Digestion, which is breaking down those food molecules into smaller components. Absorption, where the digested nutrients are actually absorbed into the bloodstream and then carried to different cells and absorbed into those cells. And then lastly, egestion, which is the removal of waste from the body. The digestive system includes both the pathway that food travels through as it's being broken down, and also the accessory organs which produce and secrete digestive enzymes, but that food does not pass through. So pretty much everything that's on this diagram is a structure that you need to be familiar with the exception of the appendix, which we don't actually care about. Fun fact, I got my appendix removed in 2020. Okay, so the oral cavity refers to the mouth. This is where food is ingestion, and it's also the first place that digestion starts to happen. So it starts as both physical and chemical digestion. The physical digestion is like chewing the food to break it down into smaller pieces. You have your front teeth, which are called incisors. They're used for cutting. The canines, the pointy ones, are used for tearing, especially into things like meat. The molars and premolars crush and grind the food. And your teeth are all covered in enamel, which is actually the hardest substance in the human body. And this physical digestion is really important because it increases the surface area of your food particles, which means that the chemical digestion can work more efficiently. This is also where chemical digestion happens as well. We'll talk about that when we get to the salivary glands. At the very back of the oral cavity, you have something called the pharynx. This is where essentially like your windpipe and your esophagus both come up and open into the back of the mouth. So it's right above where those 2 tubes kind of separate. Okay, so the salivary glands are responsible for the chemical digestion that takes place in the mouth. They produce saliva and then secrete that into the oral cavity. The saliva contains an enzyme called amylase, which breaks down starches into simple carbs. It also helps to just dissolve the food particles and lubricate them so you can swallow more easily. Then we have the esophagus, which is the tube going from the opening at the back of the mouth down to the stomach. The food is actually going to stretch out the walls of the esophagus as you like swallow a lump of food. And that stretching of the walls of the esophagus activates something called peristalsis, which is like rhythmic contractions of your esophagus that pushes the food down. That is an involuntary movement, obviously. You can't think about doing it, but this is why you're able to eat like lying down, or why astronauts are able to eat. So you don't need gravity in order for food to go down the esophagus. Those rhythmic contractions will push the food down the esophagus, even in the absence of gravity. The stomach is then at the other end of the esophagus. That is the site of both food storage and protein digestion. The stomach also absorbs small amounts of water. It absorbs some medicines, some vitamins. The stomach has 3 different layers of muscle that all run in different directions. Those muscles contract in order to churn the food in the stomach. Then at either end of the stomach, you have these little circular muscles that contract in order to control food coming into or out of the stomach. If they're closed, food can't come in or out. The top one can open up to let food in. The bottom one can open up to let food go out. Those circular muscles are called sphincters. The sphincter between the esophagus and the stomach is called the lower esophageal sphincter. The sphincter between the stomach and the small intestine is called the pyloric sphincter. The stomach is J-shaped and it has a bunch of ridges on the inside so that it can kind of like expand outwards like an accordion when your stomach is full, and then kind of fold in on itself to shrink when your stomach is empty. The cells that line the inner wall of the stomach secrete gastric fluids which help with digestion. So the stomach physically digests food with those muscle contractions that churn the food, and chemically digest the food with the gastric fluid. The gastric fluid is also called gastric juice, and it contains mucus, hydrochloric acid, and pepsinogens. The mucus is basic, which helps to protect the stomach lining. The hydrochloric acid kills harmful substances that are ingested, and it converts the pepsinogens into pepsin. And then pepsin is an enzyme that can actually break down the protein. The pH inside of the stomach is usually between 2 and 3. That is because of the hydrochloric acid, which is a fairly strong acid. The enzyme pepsin works best at these low pHs. So if the pH of the stomach did for some reason get too high, the pepsin would stop functioning. And I mean, normally, if your skin, for example, came into contact with something that had a pH of 2 to 3, that would dissolve your skin. That doesn't happen to your stomach lining because it is protected from the hydrochloric acid by the alkaline mucus. The mucus kind of hangs out around your stomach lining and neutralizes the acid that's coming into contact with your stomach lining. The mucus also protects the protein of the stomach, since the inside of your stomach and all of your organs are made of protein, and pepsin digests protein. The only thing that is protecting your stomach from being digested by the pepsin is the mucus. So the mucus kind of acts as like a protective layer to shield the inside of your stomach from the pepsin that would otherwise digest it. If the gastric fluid happens to get up into your esophagus, that can cause pain because the esophagus doesn't have that mucus lining. That pain is oftentimes referred to as like heartburn, but it has nothing to do with your heart. Really, it's just the gastric fluid essentially kind of burning your esophagus, which is usually happens when people are like lying down after they eat and their lower esophageal sphincter is open and some of that gastric fluid goes up. H. pylori bacteria can break down the mucus lining of your stomach, which then exposes the cells on the inside of your stomach to the pepsin and the hydrochloric acid, which is actually how people develop ulcers. So people used to think that ulcers were caused by stress. We now know that it's caused by this infection of H. pylori bacteria. And back when the scientists first discovered this and he was trying to kind of like prove to the scientific community that this was true, and no one was believing him because they all thought it was stress related. And so what he did is he tested his stomach for ulcers and he didn't have any. And then he took a beaker of H. pylori bacteria and drank it, giving himself an infection of that kind of bacteria, and then developed ulcers. And that's kind of how he proved that that's what causes ulcers. And then he just took some antibiotics, killed off the H. pylori bacteria, and his stomach ulcers went away. Okay, so this is what the stomach looks like. These are the 3 different layers of muscles that contract your food. These are all of the different folds inside so that you can stretch out when your stomach is full. You've got this circular sphincter right here that would pinch, close off the stomach so that food doesn't leave, and then open up to let it leave into the small intestine. We have another circular sphincter right here that separates the esophagus from the stomach. And yeah, the whole inside of the stomach would again be coated with that mucus to protect it from the hydrochloric acid and the pepsin. Okay, then we get into the small intestine, which is about 7 meters long in humans and has a diameter of about 2.5 centimeters or an inch. The small intestine has 3 different regions. There's the duodenum, which attaches to the stomach where the pyloric sphincter is, the jejunum, which is the middle section, and the ileum, which connects to the large intestine. Most of the chemical digestion does happen in the duodenum, that first section. By the way, duodenum, also sometimes pronounced duodenum, both, you can pronounce it however you want. The small intestine is the site where most absorption takes place. So most of your nutrients are going to be absorbed here. There are things called villi, which are just small kind of finger-like projections that line the entire inside of the small intestine. That increases the surface area of the small intestine so that more absorption can take place there. And then there's actually microvilli, which are these little tiny bumps on your villi, which further increase the surface area. Each villi, so each one of those little fingers, has a capillary network, which is connected to a lymph vessel called a lacteal. The lacteals are responsible for transporting the products of lipid digestion to the circulatory system. So when you break down a lipid or a fat, you get fatty acids and glycerol. Those are going to be absorbed into the lacteal and then into the circulatory system. Other products of digestion, like your amino acids, when you break down proteins, or your monosaccharides, when you break down carbs, all of those can just diffuse or absorb directly into the circulatory system through the capillaries. So those don't have to go through the lacteals. Only your fatty acids and glycerol have to kind of go through that middle step of going through the lacteals. So this is your small intestine. If you zoom in, you can see all of these little villi with the microvilli, which are those little bumps on top of them. If you kind of zoom in on your villi here, you can see that in each individual villi, there is the capillaries, which are the like red area, and then the lymph, which is that kind of greenish area. So again, most of the nutrients that you're absorbing are going to go directly into your capillaries, directly into your blood vessels. The exception to that is when your fats break down, the products of that have to go into the lacteals first and then into the capillary. Then after the small intestine, we get into the large intestine. It's about 1.5 meters long, so much shorter than the small intestine, but it's about 6.7 centimeters in diameter, so much, much wider. By the time the food gets here, chemical digestion is done, so there's no more chemical digestion in the large intestine. That happens a lot in the stomach and small intestine. The colon, which is the biggest part of the large intestine, is where most water absorption happens in the body. Some salts, minerals, and vitamins that are dissolved in the water also get absorbed here. And the colon also stores waste that is just left over from digestion. The large intestine contains bacteria like E. coli, which helps break down some of that waste into vitamins like vitamin B and vitamin K. But a lot of the waste is just cellulose, which humans can't digest and just have to egest, or poop out, essentially. So as waste builds up in the large intestine, the receptors in the wall are going to signal the nervous system, which is going to then trigger a bowel movement. That essentially happens when muscles in the intestine contract to kind of move the waste downwards into the rectum. And then the waste will leave the body through the anus, which is just the sphincter at the end of your rectum. So yeah, this is the last stage of the digestive process, the egestion portion, where waste is expelled from the body. So this is a picture of your large intestine here. So as the waste is kind of moving up and across the large intestine, that's going to be where a lot of water absorption is happening. And then as it's moving back down the descending part of the colon, it's going to be like signaling to your nervous system that a bowel movement needs to happen soon. That'll push the waste down into the rectum where it is stored until you actually go to the bathroom. Okay, so that is the pathway of food through the digestive system, but we also have things called accessory organs, which food doesn't go through, but which is still, these are really important for the digestive process. So the accessory organs are the pancreas, the liver, and the gallbladder. The pancreas is super important for like digestive enzymes and different chemicals and stuff like that. So once food moves from the stomach into the small intestine, the hydrochloric acid and the pepsin that were in the gastric fluid of the stomach also moves into the small intestine. And as soon as the acid hits the small intestine, it is going to convert a hormone called prosecretin, pro meaning before, into secretin. So the acid hits the small intestine, prosecretin, which is in the small intestine, gets converted into secretin. The hormone secretin is then going to travel through the bloodstream to the pancreas, and it's going to trigger the release of bicarbonate ions from the pancreas. The bicarbonate ions then travel back through your bloodstream to the small intestine, and bicarbonate ions are basic. So when they get to the small intestine, they react with the hydrochloric acid and neutralize it. That in turn raises the pH from an acidic one to a pH of like usually between 7 and 9. And if you remember, pepsin works best at a pH of like 2 to 3. Once the pH gets to between 7 and 9, the pepsin no longer functions. So the bicarbonate ions essentially protect the small intestine by being chemically burned by the hydrochloric acid or being digested by the pepsin, just by neutralizing the hydrochloric acid and then increasing the pH to one that inactivates pepsin. The pancreas also secretes a bunch of different digestive enzymes which travel to the small intestine. There's trypsinogen, which travels to the small intestine, where it converts enterokinase converts it into trypsin, so trypsinogen becomes trypsin, and then the trypsin just breaks down partially digested proteins into smaller peptides. Then you have erythrin, which takes those small peptides and breaks them down into amino acids. You also have some amylase, which is the enzyme that's found in your saliva as well. And this is going to break large carbs down into disaccharides, which can then be broken down into monosaccharides after. And then the pancreas also secretes lipases, which break down lipids. There's two different types. There's the pancreatic lipase, which breaks down fats into fatty acids and glycerol. And then the phospholipase, which breaks down your phospholipids. Okay, so lots of different enzymes also come from the pancreas. This is kind of where you would find the pancreas. It's usually tucked in kind of like underneath and behind the stomach. Then we get to the liver and gallbladder. The liver is constantly producing bile, which is a fluid containing bile salts. And bile salts help to physically break down fat. It is important that you know that bile is not something that chemically digests fat. It physically breaks it down. So it's not unlike, say, your lipases, which would take a fat and break it into fatty acids and glycerol. It's actually breaking the fat molecule into different molecules. With bile salts, all it's doing is taking a large fat molecule and breaking it into smaller fat molecules. But they're still fat molecules. They haven't been broken down into like fatty acids and glycerol. So that's the difference between, say, an enzyme which chemically breaks down fats or other nutrients, and bile, which physically breaks it down. It's just taking a large fat molecule, breaking it into smaller fat molecules. So when the stomach is empty, the bile is just going to be stored and concentrated in the gallbladder, which is into the bottom of the liver. And then if the food is there and it's fatty, needs to be broken down, the gallbladder will release that bile into the stomach. When fats enter the small intestine, there is a hormone called CCK, or cholecytokinin. It's released into the bloodstream and carried to the gallbladder. It's going to cause the bile salts to be released, which, like I said, causes the physical breakdown of fat. The liver also does a bunch of other things. It breaks down hemoglobin from red blood cells, which can also get stored in the gallbladder. The liver also stores glycogen, as well as some different vitamins, and it helps convert toxins in your body into less harmful substances. So for example, alcohol, which can be converted. Digestion is controlled by not only the nervous system, but also hormones. So anytime you taste, smell, or see food, that is going to cause gastric fluid to be secreted into the stomach. Swallowing also causes gastric fluid to be secreted. Gastrin is a hormone that is produced anytime the walls of your stomach are stretched by food. That gastrin is going to cause the release of hydrochloric acid into the stomach. If you have a really fatty meal, the small intestine is going to release a hormone called enterogastrone, which essentially just slows down the small intestine so that it has more time to break down that really fatty meal and absorb all the nutrients. Okay, I'm going to switch over to my document cam now just to kind of review a few of these things. Okay, so here's a diagram of the digestive system, and I realize it is a bit tricky to see all of this, but we have the mouth opening right here. We call that the oral cavity. You have these 3 glands, 1, 2, 3. Those are the salivary glands that release the saliva into the oral cavity. Right at the back, kind of after the oral cavity, before you have the esophagus and the windpipe, that is your pharynx. This big long tube here then is your esophagus. That would attach to the stomach, which is right here. So this is the stomach. The stomach then attaches to the small intestine, which is all down here. So that's the small intestine, which then connects right here to the large intestine. All the way around here is the large intestine. Then we get to the rectum at the bottom, and the opening at the bottom of the rectum is the anus. You do also have the appendix here, which again, you do not need to know. And then as far as our accessory organs go, you have the pancreas, which is tucked in underneath the stomach over here. You have this large shape, which is the liver. It's actually your largest internal organ, second largest organ of the body after skin. And then tucked in underneath that is the gallbladder. It's right there. Okay, so that is all the different parts of the digestive system that you need to know. And of course, you need to know their functions in detail. Okay, next I just want to kind of briefly review this one job of the pancreas, which is to protect the small intestine. So the stomach is going to open up and it's going to drop food as well as pepsin and hydrochloric acid into the small intestine. I've drawn the hydrochloric acid in red here because the hydrochloric acid is actually going to be what triggers the small intestine to kind of go through the rest of this process. So the hydrochloric acid, when it gets into the small intestine, it is going to cause the conversion of prosecretin into secretin. The secretin then goes to the pancreas and causes it to release the bicarbonate ions. The bicarbonate ions then travel back to the small intestine where they neutralize the hydrochloric acid. And once the hydrochloric acid is neutralized, that means that the pH has come up, which is going to deactivate the pepsin. So that is one of the big jobs of the pancreas. It's to protect the small intestine from the hydrochloric acid and the pepsin of the stomach. The other big job of the small intestine, or sorry, of the pancreas, is its different digestive enzymes. So in this diagram here, or in this flow chart, this is actually like 5 little flow charts, but But here, what I have is I've written in the enzyme that's coming from the small intestine in red. So we have enterokinase, which is going to travel to the pancreas and cause trypsinogen to be converted into trypsin. And then trypsin breaks the proteins into smaller peptides. Then in the other four, you have hormones that are just coming directly from the pancreas. So epipsin causes peptides to be converted into amino acids. Amylase causes carbs to be converted into disaccharides. Pancreatic lipase causes the conversion of triglycerides into fatty acids and glycerol. And our phospholipase is going to cause the conversion of phospholipids into fatty acids, glycerol, and a phosphate. Okay. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Let me know if you have any other questions about this.